Today, my special guest is Gary Wayne, and we're going to discuss his book, The Genesis 6 Conspiracy. Gary, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and so happy to be here. Really looking forward to our discussion today, and hopefully we're going to raise some curiosity amongst your audience.
Yes, I think we're definitely going to cover some ground that I haven't covered for my audience before, so I'm definitely excited about that. One of the things I wanted to start with, Gary, in the book, you describe yourself as a Christian contrarian. I think some of the listeners maybe haven't encountered that term before. So when you describe yourself like that, tell us what you mean.
Yeah, so it's kind of an extension on the standard meaning of contrarian, but it's kind of rooted in how I came back to Jesus and to God. I, like most people, well, not like most people, but a lot of people, I was raised Christian, but as I went through education and teenage years and early 20s, I kind of fell away from Christ. And so when I came back, it was actually through reading a book by Hal Lindsey called The Late Great Planet Earth that my brother had challenged me to read if I had the courage to read it. And so I did, and I wanted to verify what he had said in the book because I found it very, very compelling. And so that led me back to God. And as I came back, I wanted to verify things for myself. I didn't want to understand the Bible and the doctrines out of the Bible and what people teach through other people. I wanted to verify everything myself. And as a contrarian, that's what a contrarian does. And so I wanted to come to my own conclusions and see how that matched up, as opposed to standard theology that's perhaps being taught out there. And that did lead me to some different conclusions and some different paths. There's no doubt about that. Not that Christianity is sort of this monolith of centered doctrine. I mean, every church has their own emphasis, and there's so many different variations. And so that's how I became a Christian contrarian. And I take that view to everything else that I research. I don't want to go by what somebody said about something. I might find that interesting, but if I find it interesting enough, I want to verify it for myself. How do I find another source? How do I find verification and justify the veracity of that? And then everything I do, which I don't think is contrarian, but I think it's very helpful for your audience to maybe know is that even though I've gone down the rabbit hole into researching other religions, mythologies, secret society documents, everything I read, I measure back against what it says in the Bible. And so I might use it for context, or I might use it for understanding how they perceive things, but now I take it back to how I understand the Bible and see whether that matches up or not.
That's very helpful. Thank you for explaining that term and just giving us a little bit more context for how you go about doing what you do. I mean, if we look at this book, if you're watching this on video, it's substantial. You know, you're going to have to invest some time into reading that. And that would lead me into my next question, actually. I mean, clearly you've put thousands of hours of research into the book. And for you, I'm always curious to find out what was the catalyst or spark that got you started down the path of exploring these topics. Usually there's some sort of an aha moment or something that happens that gets you interested in a specific topic like this.
Three sort of turning points in coming to write the book. And so I came back to Christianity already being a mythology buff and already being a history buff, and I became a prophecy buff. And so as I was filing and writing down and correlating all of the different narratives in prophecy, and there's many, many different prophecy streams, you have to go through the complete Bible so you can put all the verses together, right? And it's what I try and do on all things that I try and come to conclusions on. So, but you don't have to get very far into Genesis to get into Genesis 6 and find that that's very, very odd. And even the whole Genesis story before the flood has some interesting sort of questions that are going to rise. And then after the flood, these darn giants keep popping up again. And then as you get towards the end of the book into the New Testament and then further into Revelations, you have the sort of concept of fallen angels and rebellion and being thrown down to the earth in Revelation 12. You have this odd thing in Revelation 9 about the abyss and the demons and the things coming out of the abyss. You've got demons coming out of people's mouths. You've got Jesus and Matthew talking about his second coming and the end times, going to be like the days of Noah. So what I thought I would do is just to write a very short book and sort of cut my process and ability to write and investigate on a short book, connect Genesis 6 to Revelation, and then go deeper into prophecy. So that's what started it. And then as I started to venture outside a little bit for, what do other cultures and saying, and understanding that I'm a mythology and a history buff, like you hear of these titans in Greek mythology, or the Anunnaki and Sumerian mythology, or the Myosi that people may not be familiar with in Chinese mythology, or the Daitria or the Azura, and there's Danua in Indian subcontinent, Indian mythology, and Ixelba in the not Machu Picchu, but the Quiché Maya mythology and the Popol Vuh. And you've got these similar type of beings in all these other mythologies. And as we did further research into that, what changed my approach is that they're all telling the same story. So now I wanted to do a little bit more than just connect Genesis 6 with end time prophecy. I wanted to know what more they said and how similar that was. And that opened a door because now I started getting into some occult writers or Masonic writers because they're one and the same. And then I found out that the secret societies have a whole set of books and history that they rely on coming out of prehistory, again, telling the same story. And as soon as I went through that door of the occult and secret societies, well, that changed it to a conspiracy book. And then I wanted to sort of tell one narrative from Genesis 6 to the end time. And all of a sudden, I didn't realize how big of a project I was into. And every time I wanted to be finished, I'm saying, I'm done. I just kept being shown more sources. And if I was at a dead end, I'd get shown another source. And I just wasn't seemingly permitted to put it down. And finding books that I never thought, or sources I never thought I could find, would come out of nowhere, and it would just fit in perfectly. And I literally wrote the first 10 chapters, and there's 98 plus preface and an epilogue in it, so it's a long book. I did that probably in the first year or two, but then filling in the difference, and the book essentially stayed the same. I was just putting in more detail as I went. So bit of a story as to how I went from a very simple idea to a very complex project, but that's what happened.
Wow. That's an interesting journey. It's fun to hear that what you thought was a very simple and straightforward project has just grown and grown and grown. And I would imagine even today you're still encountering new sources and other things that you could even add if you wanted to at this point.
Oh, absolutely, because you keep coming across more things. And I also took out 25 to 30% of the book, say 300 pages, which is all, a book in itself of a fairly sizable book, just to whittle it down to be publishable. It's a long read to begin with, and it's a long journey, but I just couldn't imagine a publisher saying, I'm going to publish an 11 or 1200 page book, which of course they wouldn't have, and especially with somebody unknown. So I presented two unique things to anybody who wanted to publish me, was as unknown, no platform, and an expensive book. So, but my publisher, Deep River Publishing, was very, very gracious about it, and they liked the idea, and we got it done.
Well, and one of the things I really like about the way your book is laid out, if somebody wants to learn more about a particular topic, just with the way you have the table of contents sorted, I mean, if you just wanted to go deeper on one of the specific topic areas that you jump into, I mean, I'm thinking this could almost be sort of a desk reference of somebody who's reading and studying this sorts of material. Is that kind of a way you've seen some people use it?
Yes, exactly. I get told that over and over, and that was one of the objectives. Is I wanted to bring some credibility to the genre and do the most research that what I thought anybody else might have done, and from more sources, and connect more dots than anybody had done before, but also to write it in a way that they could go back and reference it reasonably easy, even though it's a large book. So as I said, there's 98 chapters, but each chapter is a mini story within a larger story. And so it leads into the next chapter, and it will keep coming up as the book unfolds as it's appropriate. And again, I wrote it that way because it's a long book, and I wanted to continue to people to read the book and continue along the journey, but that they could put it down pretty much at any point in time. So even though it's an 800-page book, there's over 120 pages of endnotes. So you can read a chapter, put it down, and come back and pick up, or read several chapters. And I'll guarantee you can't read too many chapters all at once anyways, because there's just too much information there.
Well, and one of the fortunate things is the chapters are reasonably sized. So, I mean, you could sit down and read 1 or 2 chapters easily in a setting and then come back later. So don't worry, even though it's a long book, the chapters are manageable. You'll be able to tackle it. So my hope for our conversation today is that we can touch on ground that's going to be somewhat familiar to the listeners. You know, we're going to talk about people from the Bible and places that you've probably heard of before. And what I want Gary to do is just take us into some of the ways he talks about those particular names and places in the book, some of the unique things that he has discovered in his research. So we're going to start off with the Garden of Eden. So when it comes to Adam, the Garden of Eden, and something that was new to me, the 7 sacred sciences, what are some of the things that you uncover for us in the book? What do we need to know about those?
Sure. So I'll take things and develop sort of an idea that maybe people haven't really looked at deeper enough. So in the Adam story in Eden, he is put into Eden after being formed, right away after being formed, and he's obviously not educated, not been taught a whole bunch of stuff, and yet he's going to move into an agrarian situation. And as we all know, farming takes time to learn, right? So he's being taught things about farming. And I was wondering, what more he might have been taught on that from God as being created for a special commission to raise what I think is humans above the angels in a future time. And I wanted to keep my mind open as to what that sort of meant, because again, afterwards he starts an agrarian society after Eden and has descendants that's civilizing the world, and they're developing at a fast rate. So in terms of that knowledge and technology, so I mean, what did he learn there? And what was shocking was, again, and so I measure everything up against what the Bible says, and it makes sense to me that God would teach Adam a whole bunch of things that he needed to know. When I got into the secret societies, they teach that Adam was taught the 7 sacred sciences. And the sciences names are a little bit mundane, like grammar and rhetoric, the art of persuasion and dialectics, the basic arts and sciences that you're going to learn today, which is no coincidence. Arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, except that geometry, known in the craft, is known as masonry, from where they get their name. And of course, they believe their societies were formed in the ancient time from these 7 sacred sciences as an extension of that and the mystical religion that Enoch, son of Cain, develops from Cain. And so they talk about all of this knowledge, as they call the 7 sacred sciences, being taught to Adam while he was in Eden. And he maintains this knowledge after leaving Eden. And then he teaches it to 3 people, Cain, Abel, and then later Seth. Of course, obviously, Abel is murdered by Cain. Cain is ostracized. And so we have this knowledge pure from heaven coming from God being taught to both Seth and to Cain, who are going to use it in very, very, very different ways. And so astronomy, as what Jewish mysticism or Jewish legends and sort of Jewish accounts will say, was the biggest of the 7 sciences, which is the 7th science that the Sethites used because they were an agrarian society for planting and seeding like that. But Enoch, son of Evil, develops these sciences in ways that are not designed to lead people to God, not designed to give honor to the creator of the universe, because Cain continues in his rebellion and he raises Enoch accordingly. So it's designed to discredit God for everything, not give him credit for anything, to lead people away and to start honoring the pantheon that they're creating, or the fallen angels that he's taking up as his mentors and are giving him additional illicit information. And so these are the 7 sacred sciences that come down through history that ripple. And it's not that any of the sciences are evil, even though you have astrology, which is a perversion of astronomy being developed by Enoch in all the polytheist religions. But it's how those sciences are used. Right? Knowledge isn't evil. It's can you discern doing good with it or bad? And knowledge, as we know, always is a double-edged sword. So how is it going to be applied? And it's what happens with the Cainites, with these 7 sacred sciences, that they apply all of this knowledge to virtually corrupt the whole antediluvian world as they continue to develop, and that develops through Cain. So that's just a quick summary of the beginning of the sciences, and that's how Freemasonry links themselves in, because Enoch creates mysticism first, which is the sun-worshipping religion and the polytheist pantheon that you see around the world. And they develop what I call snake brotherhoods for imagery and for a reason, or secret societies to develop specific aspects of these sciences, to build great monoliths to honor the pantheon of the gods. And they'll give in the secret societies credit to Enoch for supplying the knowledge to build the pyramids, for example. Right, so they develop this to a great level, and these secret societies develop from the mystical religions and the knowledge, and the additional illicit knowledge that the fallen angels are providing.
Next, let's move ahead a little bit further in the book of Genesis. So in Genesis 6, we encounter the sons of God and the daughters of man coming together. You know, a lot of people who don't want to wrestle with the whole Nephilim giant issue just try to apply a kind of what's known as the Sethite view here to deal with this. And you explain that some in the book, but you obviously go in a different direction. So maybe explain the differences, say, between the Sethite view and where you go in your book.
And I want to be respectful of everybody's position when in the Bible, even though we may disagree on some things. I don't think anything in the Bible or Christianity should be dividing people, so we need to be respectful. And there is a divide on, for sure, as to how you interpret, so to speak, Genesis 6. And I think maybe interpret might be maybe a little bit strong, but how you understand it at least, right? And so there are these giants that are created as they're called in the King James Bible, or Nephilim as they are called in other translations. And giant goes back in Genesis 6, and in Numbers when it's talking about the Nephilim, it goes back to, or the giants in King James Bible, both of those words go back to Nephilim in Hebrew. So it's the same thing. Doesn't matter which translation that you're talking about. And so when we talk about giants, I mean, all of a sudden we have something being created that is completely different, as people understand giants, than just the normal offspring of, if they're humans, as in the sons of Seth with the daughters of men, which again would be either Cainites or Sethites, depending on how you want to understand that. So that's the first thing that sort of gets me as odd. That is either a huge overstatement. I don't think the Bible does that. And giant is understood to be a significantly larger being and a more powerful being as it comes down, as it rolls through the Old Testament. And so when I look at the sons of God, if I go to Job, where we have either angels or sons of God, again, depending on your translation of the Bible that you're using, you know, you're going to have it in 2:1:1:6 and 34:4-7. And it says the sons of God are angels and vice versa. So one will have a connection back and forth. So we understand from an Old Testament perspective that the sons of God are angels. Now, people will argue differently and say, from a Sethite perspective, let's go to the New Testament and let's go to Acts at the Pentecost. And there at the Pentecost, Christians being grafted into the New Covenant are essentially being adopted in as sons of God, as joint heirs with Jesus, right? And so that's an argument for the sons of God in the Old Testament being humans as opposed to fallen angels, which I think the sons of God are. But if we look further at how that develops in the idea of this adoption process, that's a bit of an allegory, right, as an adoption. But it's a process where we do become part of the New Covenant. But it doesn't mean we're physical sons of God, as what these sons of God are listed in the Old Testament, or what they produce for the sons of those sons of God. And so if we go further into whether, it doesn't matter whether it's Romans or it's Galatians, this sort of adoption process comes through. And in John, it talks about, you know, we're adopted through Jesus, but because we believe in Jesus, we have the right to be the children of God, right? But what really gets me is a distinction as we keep going down this sort of process of what adoption is we get to Hebrews 12:7. And what it says in Hebrews 12:7 is that God treats us as sons even though we have human fathers, right? I think that's a completely different concept than what's being talked about in Genesis 6. Then I go back to ancient writers like Josephus at the time of the writing of the Bible, and historical writers. They all understood the Nephilim were the giants of Genesis 6, because they obviously didn't have a King James version back then. 1610 was when that was translated. They understood this was talking about angels copulating with human females. So this is a very old document, and it goes back into how the Jewish people understood the Old Testament as well. Again, not that I want to put too much emphasis on the Targum, because it strays from the Bible as it adds its oral traditions to the Bible. But again, it clearly understood that that was a literal translation of sons of God as being angels. And this idea that they're not angels, the sons of God, is more of a recent sort of introduction into Christianity. And you don't even hear of it before the 1600s.
Now, let's go back to the lines of Seth and Cain, and you already alluded to this a little bit with one of your earlier answers. But what do we see going on in those two lines leading up to the flood? As they're working out the seven sacred sciences, what's happening, and we could say is even the catalyst for why the flood comes?
The first thing, in case people haven't taken the time to notice, is there's two lineages, one of Seth and one of Cain in the Old Testament. And the names are spelt very similarly and pronounced very similarly in a lot of cases. So you don't want to get them confused. You want to understand who was who and who was from each line, and particularly Enoch, son of Cain, as opposed to Enoch, son of Jared, right? One's holy, one's evil. And one's raptured and one isn't. Or maybe raptured is an overstatement, but taken to heaven anyway. And so when we talk about what's going on in the Cain line, they are progressing through every generation, becoming more and more evil. And even though Enoch invents things like hieroglyphs and writing and books and starts to develop, you have a renaissance that's going on of these sciences according to other sources, Freemasonry in particular. In the history of Freemasonry by Albert Mackey does a terrific job with these legends that they rely on in their Polychronicon in the secret chambers of the societies, is that they have a renaissance of the sciences and an explosion of the sciences in the generation of Lamech. And again, there's two Lamechs, right? There's a Lamech on the Seth side as well. And that's how they kind of conflate the secret societies and polytheists. They'll conflate the two lines, and they'll try and say, actually, it's the Seth line that is forged, and this is the real line. But to hide from the Christian church over the last couple thousand years, they'll adopt the Seth line to hide behind. So they'll talk about Enoch as an example as the holy Enoch, even though all of their accounts clearly make him a different account. And it's important to understand that Enoch on both sides wrote scriptures, or seemingly wrote scriptures. But the ones written by Enoch, son of Cain, those aren't good ones, right? They're obviously designed to lead people away from God and have a different perspective on prehistory. And it's important to understand because the Essenes who come out of Qumran are a third sect of Judaism at the time of Jesus. And they believe in Enoch, son of Cain, as the greatest patriarch. And the Essenes are connected to Freemasonry as one of the forming communities of Freemasonry of the modern era of Masonry, if I can put it that way. And they're polytheists. And their most holy book is the Book of Jubilees, accredited to Enoch, Enoch, son of Cain. And they believed in fallen angels and wouldn't give up their names even upon death. And so we need to understand that when we have these documents coming out of the Qumran community, we have to use a lot of discernment as to what is written and how they line up with the Bible. Now, they also use the Old Testament, and they accurately recorded those. They just have a polytheist spin on it. That's another rabbit hole to go down, but that's one of the important reasons to understand who the Essenes are and how they connect back to this time of Enoch. So they have this renaissance of these sciences that are just going to explode the technology starting in the generation of Lamech. And at this time, which corresponds to the generation of Jared and the sons of Lamech of Cain, you have Genesis 6 taking place. So you have this coming together of fallen angels providing knowledge and supporting the Cainites and developing knowledge of them, establishing secret societies and mystical religions to worship the pantheon. And then you have them coming together with the fallen angels to produce these giants. And what they do is they usurp the kingships of the antediluvian epoch and then impose this religion and these sciences on the people of the antediluvian world, essentially enslaving them, because if they don't accept it, they're going to die. And so you have a corruption of the earth this way, with this type of hybrid being created through the sons of God and human females. And I'll also make the case in the book very lightly, but I do spend a lot of time on shows discussing it because people like to talk about it, that they actually developed that technology to a level greater than what we have today. And how I arrive at that, and again, some people will maybe object to applying what Jesus said about the sign of the end time and the second coming will be like the days of Noah, because this is certainly about the days of Noah. Noah lived both before and after the flood, right? 350 years after the flood as well. So I would also say we need to understand those 350 years after the flood as well. And Noah is born at the time the Nephilim are created, and he's around at the time of Jared. So these are still the days of Noah. And so if our technology is where it is today, and we're not in the end time yet, then if you look at that, then that means that that technology may have been more advanced than we have today. And then it certainly explains how you can build Machu Picchu or the pyramids or the great megaliths. And it starts to bring into other ideas that if they could do that with the development of these 7 sciences, then how much of the world did they corrupt more than just with what we hear of violence in Genesis? Did they corrupt the genome of plants? Did they corrupt more of the DNA with other animals? And did they do it to an extent that basically was taking away the original creation away from what God had originally designed? And if we look at the word corrupt, it basically means ruin, spoil, as it comes up out of Hebrew. So there's a case, and this is speculation, I grant you, that it's more than just the violence, that the whole world was corrupt. And it was all against the laws of creation. And that's what made God grieve, not just the violence. That was just a symptom or a manifestation of all of this corruption.
So we're just going to say the flood happens, but we still end up with giants after the flood. So give us your perspective on that, because a lot of people would say, well, there was a worldwide flood. Everything got annihilated except for Noah and his family. Yet, interestingly enough, we have giants that pop up in different places afterwards. So talk to us about how we see giants after the flood.
Yeah, it's one of those great mysteries. So I'll shed some light on it. So what we do know is that in Genesis 6 it says that they were both before and after, right? So at the times of Noah. And so you can understand that as that they were going to be after the flood as well. That doesn't tell us how they survived. And if we look at what most people will understand the flood story is everything on the earth was destroyed, right? I would grant that in Genesis 6 and in 7, if you look at what God says he's going to destroy, he says he's going to destroy everything he created. Well, if you understand that the giants came from angels, he didn't create the giants. So that's a possibility. But again, you're kind of stretching that, but it's a possibility. And then we have these giants show up like the Raphaim and the Anakim and the Zanzumim and the Emin and the Abin and the Ozim and on and on and on, the Horites or the Horim and the Amalekites. And you have Seir coming in as a member of the Horites out of nowhere in the Table of Nations, and none of these peoples are recorded in the Table of Nations or their descendancy. They just come up out of nowhere, and they're all understood to be giants. And of course, if you do a linkage of Rephaim and Anakim, you understand that Anakim are Rephaim and Anakim are Nephilim, and you have this sort of branch that goes right back to this odd word Nephilim that's, again, only rooted twice in the Old Testament, in Numbers, where it's talking about Anakim descend from the Nephilim, and in Genesis 6, where giants goes back to Nephilim. And so they show up out of nowhere, and we're not told how. We need to understand that if it happened, and it seems like it did, because the Bible does record that in the Old Testament, that they survived the flood somehow, or were recreated, that God has ordained this, right? He is omnipotent. So how does that happen? Well, there's only 3 ways it can happen in sort of subgroups. And some Christians, and there's some good writers out there, believe that they put their weight on somehow on the ark, as I call it. And somehow on the ark includes with the wives as having the DNA or being giants, right? But most Christians will say somehow they carried the DNA. They were part of that corruption we're talking about. And that's how they crossed the flood. And if you get into the Gnostic Gospels, which again, one of the reasons why I lean away from on the ark somehow, is they have many accounts where Tubal-Cain, as you saw in the last movie of the flood, hides on the ark. And out of Jewish mysticism, that's how Og survives the flood. And they also believe in Gnostic Gospels as well, and there are many Gnostic Gospels on this, that Ham was a giant, or Ham and Japheth were a giant, or all three sons were giants, or every one on there was a giant, right? And for the reason that this was designed to give humans a new start, I'm not sure that God would give us mixed DNA for a new start, right? So it's possible, but I don't tend to lean on that one. My number one is second incursion, which means that the angels who weren't locked in the abyss, and for people who may not understand how you go down this rabbit hole of these giants, that the angels, as talked about in 2 Peter and in Jude, these are the ones that are locked into the abyss for copulating with human females. But the ones who didn't weren't locked into the abyss. And there were a lot of angels that rebelled, because in Revelation we're told there's 100 million angels, and in Revelation 12 we're told a third of them rebelled, right? So it's like 33 million angels. So there was a lot. So not all of them are in the abyss, and those ones who didn't commit this violation against creation before the flood, I think is a good possibility that they did it at either Sodom and Gomorrah or at Babel. And the reason why I say that is that, again, the Gnostics will also give stories about giants being recreated by angels there. Again, we don't have that in the Bible, but it seems more likely, and it's sort of, you don't have to start going very legalistic on some words in Genesis to make this true, right? Like I gave us some possibilities. And then the other way of doing it is somehow on another ark or off the earth, right? And so again, off the earth might mean, as some people might envision, inside the earth. I don't tend to go along with that one. I mean, that's possible, and there's biblical references that says about caves and this and that, but I don't think that. The Gnostics will also say that Amakaseth, who is created as a Nephilim, this is a different Seth than of the Seth line, was taken off earth in a cloud so that he could repopulate the earth. So they have some records accordingly that would suggest that. But on another ark is another possibility. If we can imagine that there might be more than one civilization that the Bible tells us about before the flood, that there were as many 4 to 9, depending on which version of other prehistory you want to go to, it's possible that people survived from other civilizations, and in particular, helped by fallen angels. And so if we look at Epic of Gilgamesh as a classic example of that, and it's used by secular society or secular institutions and universities to kind of diminish the Bible and say the Noah story is just taken off the Epic of Gilgamesh because it's an older surviving copy, right? Well, the stories are similar on a macro level, but on a micro level, the devil is in the details. So Gilgamesh, as an example, is spoken of in the Enoch Book of Giants on 4Q, about 3.0 to 3.4, I believe, as one of the giants, Enoch, son of Cain, is talking to about the coming flood. And there's nothing they can do about it. So does he survive the flood, or is he born after, as most people understand it, as a second incursion? But no matter what, he is 2/3 God and 1/3 human. Now he's telling the story to Enkidu, or Anakeddon, depending on which translation that you want to look at, and he is created after the flood, in the same way that Gilgamesh was created, to offset the viciousness and brutality of Gilgamesh, because he's a tyrant and he's absolutely out of control. And he is 2/3 God and 1/3 human. And he's also a giant. And so they become great friends. And then later, Gilgamesh is telling the story about the flood, which is Utnapishtim, or Ziusudra, again, depending on the translation that you're using, coming out of prehistory. And this is the archetypical Anunnaki. This is the archetypical giant. And so he's a tyrant, he's a warrior, he's evil, he's a potentate, and he brings all of his family and kin on the ship. So maybe Gilgamesh is kin. But either way, you have a second incursion example in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and you have another ark story. And so I look at those as perhaps giving a good, a clue, even though you could say the Gnostics have representations of Ham being and others being a giant. I just find that one a bridge too far. And then if you get into, this goes all to this, it's the same story being told in prehistory around the world, right? You have what they call the Greek Noah story. And I love that line because it's such a con. And so they're talking about Deucalion as the Greek Noah and Pyrrha as his wife and the children that are on the ark that goes with them. This is not based on the Bible. Deucalion is son of Prometheus. And Prometheus is either a titan born of another god or the parent titan. This is another Nephilim story. So you have Epic of Gilgamesh, and you have all of these giant stories on arks around the world surviving in religions and other mythologies about giants surviving. It has nothing to do with humans surviving. And I find that to be a little bit too much of a coincidence to ignore. And for the audience, if they don't understand, there's over 500 cultures around the world that multiplied into many more versions is the flood story. And pretty much all of them have giants related to the flood story and giants surviving the flood story. And you start to get the mathematical zero when you start putting in all of these coincidences that all of these cultures around the world have the same story, but it's not the Noah story. Now, there are some flood stories that out there that also have survival of humans as well, but the most of them are about giants. So those are the ways that you can arrive at that they survived the flood. Unfortunately, the Bible doesn't tell us exactly how, but they do show up and they do have an impact because, again, they usurped the kingships after the flood.
Wow, that's really fascinating. I think with the different ideas you presented, just the second incursion seems like the most likely or plausible. I think some of those other paths give us some challenges when we try to look at it through a biblical lens, but thank you for giving us some insight in some of the different ways we can arrive at having giants on the earth after the flood. Now let's move forward to one of my favorite stories from Genesis, and that's the Tower of Babel. I think a lot of people have no idea what to do with the Tower of Babel. They just think God got frustrated with these people that were building this huge tower, but really this is an interesting key to so many things. If we can unlock it in a slightly different way and understand it differently, there's a lot of important things happening there. So talk to us about how you handle the Tower of Babel in the book.
Yeah, and what's interesting about Babel, just as a quick preface, is that this is the religion of the end time, Babylon, right? So, and it is the first civilization that we're told about after the flood, right? And it's reigned over, not that it says for sure that Nimrod was ruler of Babylon, but we take that from the narrative in Genesis 10. And so you have all of the descendants of Noah at this point in time being together under the rule of one individual person, which is an antichrist type figure. But we're not told a whole bunch about Nimrod and a whole bunch about Babel. We're just told basically that Nimrod was a mighty one or a mighty hunter before the Lord, and it says that like 3 times. And we do know that if your name is going to be in the Bible, it's there for a reason, for good or for infamy, just as those descendants of Cain were listed for names of infamy in the Bible, and particularly Lamech, Tubal-Cain, Nama, Jubal, and Jubal, because they're really important patriarchs to the occultic religions and societies because they're the ones developing these sciences to a whole new level. Tubal-Cain being the master artificer of metals, as an example, and the greatest artificer in sort of the history of the Masonic belief system. And so they elevate these people to a high level. Nimrod is also remembered as the first Grand Master of Freemasonry after the flood, and he writes the first constitution. And so now when we read Babel, we have the story of this great warrior and hunter, and we're trying to figure out who he's fighting this early after the flood. I mean, these are peaceful agrarians that, and this is within 100 years of the flood. And we take it that there's a rebellion nature to what's going on here at Babel as well, and they're going to build this tower. And God says something really odd. He says, acting as one people with one language, essentially nothing is going to be prevented from them doing. And so what we see is this odd representation. Where does the skills come from to build a city, and then this tower that somehow is going to reach up into the sky? And how was that able to be relearned or understood so quickly after the flood? And so all of these parallels to how the secret societies look at Babel and how the end time is sort of taken from Babel as an allegorical understanding of the metaphors in Revelation to a great degree, compelled me to look a little deeper as to what was going on at Babel. And so this was indeed a rebellion against God, and that's why the languages are going to be confused, and so that this isn't going to happen so easily. Now, Babel is looked upon as a city of light, and the destruction of Babel is looked upon as a horrific thing done by the God of the Bible by polytheists, right? Okay, so they look at Babel totally opposite as what we do. But as you get into Josephus and into other sources, you understand that Nimrod was establishing as the first ruler over the Sethites after the flood and the descendants of Noah, a brutal dictatorship enslaving people to build this project. Because this ziggurat was going to be like many times larger than the pyramids of Giza. So he had to be a tyrant just to enslave people to do that. And he imposed a new religion on them that was going to lead them away from God. But it's the religion from the antediluvian epoch. It's the religion of Enoch the evil, and they're applying the seven sciences, and their first application of those sciences is the tower, which is the masonry tower that they're building. And ziggurat, pyramid, tower were understood as the same type of structure in the ancient time. And if you take Babel from Akkadian as opposed to Hebrew, which is confusion of language, Bab is a gateway and El is God, coming out of Akkadian. So one wonders whether or not, because again, Nimrod, he actually founds the Akkadian people as he stays in Mesopotamia, and you have the Chaldeans and you have the Babylonians and you have the Akkadians, right? So one wonders whether or not they're trying to create a gateway for the gods to come back to have a second incursion, or they're trying to create some sort of dimensional gateway into the abyss. I mean, who knows? All speculation, but it's a very odd translation that it would come out of Akkadian that way from the descendants of Nimrod. But what we understand through Freemasonry is that a fellow by the name of Hermes is a significant patriarch in the occult belief system, finds the two pillars of Lamech, who writes on these two pillars the seven sacred sciences and as much knowledge as they can put on it, and the location to where this knowledge is stored, because they know the flood is going to be coming. And they're stored in 9 vaults stacked on one top of each other, what they call the vaults of Enoch. And Enoch wrote 36,525 books of knowledge as it comes down through prehistory, plus the knowledge of what the descendants of Lamech developed and wrote down. And they store it under the pyramids that they give Enoch credit for building, or at least the knowledge for credit of building. And then Hermes finds these two pillars after the flood and brings that information back to Nimrod at Babel, and they partner to install Nimrod as like an antichrist type figure over all of humanity, with a antediluvian religion that was to be wiped out by the flood. So they start that whole rebellion all over again.
Wow. Well, there's a lot more going on there than God getting mad about some people building a large tower. Thank you for taking us down that road and explaining more of that. Let's jump out of Genesis for a bit as we begin to wrap up and just talk about a few other things. My goal here again with this interview is just to give the listeners a flavor and a taste of some of what they're going to encounter when they read the Genesis 6 conspiracy. When we think of all of the popular movies today and in comic books, we have all these heroes everywhere with special powers, people that are larger than life. Talk to us about heroes and how the different hero stories, whether these are accounts of old or in more modern times, things that we've seen in comic books and film and cartoons. How are all of these heroes kind of a callback to the Nephilim or the demigods of old?
Yeah, such a good question, because it's one of those things that's used to prepare and brainwash people for the end time, in my opinion, and people need to understand what's going on here. As you read throughout my book, you're going to learn about a whole bunch of other things to look a little bit more closely at, because they hide everything in plain sight and they think we're stupid. And seemingly they can get away with it, but more and more people are waking up to it. But hero, just as you look at the superheroes today, I mean, they've got all sorts of different forms now with bionic parts and transhumanism and extra wings and things like that, which again is another constant sort of coming out of prehistory, right? As in centaurs and Pegasus and super beings. But the word, and that's part of that the greater Nephilim concept, as I like to talk about. That's more than just the creation of Nephilim as a violation against creation, and that perhaps all of these creatures coming out of mythology, whether it's chimera or whatever, weren't just from imagination. They're part of that corruption before the flood. So, hero in the ancient world is understood completely different than how we understand hero today. Hero in the ancient world was understood as the offspring of the gods and a human female. And that's particularly right out of Greek, but it expands to all the other mythologies coming out of the world. And so if you have Poseidon as an example, which was sea of the god in Greek mythology and the god of Atlantis, he marries Clymene, which is a human female, and has 5 Titan sets of twins, or 10 giants that are going to rule over the 10-nation empire of Atlantis, more than the island of Atlantis. So it's the offspring of the gods, how it was understood in antiquity. These are the heroes, right? And they're called heroes in Greek mythology, whether or not it's in Hesiod or Hesiod, and I'm trying to think of the Greek writers. Anyways, Homer is another one that would refer to the Titans as heroes. These were giants. These were offsprings of human female and the gods. They're the same. It's the same story that's being told in Genesis, but again, from that polytheist perspective. Whether or not it's a corruption of the Genesis account or a parallel account, it's still telling the same story, just from a different perspective or a corrupted perspective. And as that rolls forward, if the end time is going to be like the days of Noah, does that mean we're going to have Nephilim marking the end time somehow, some way? And is that part of the preparation and the brainwashing that is going on with the kids today through superheroes? Now, to give another example of how they do this, because that's all sounds fine and dandy, but let me give you some of that. I'm going to hide it in plain sight for the audience. Let's take Superman, right, as in a superhero. It's kind of the ultimate one everybody knows, right? He comes from another planet or another area, just as in other belief systems, the angels or the gods come from other planets, right? Okay, and he's got this triangle on his vest that's upside down, right? So it's an upside down pyramid. Behind that is yellow, which is light, which is an allegory for occultism, for knowledge. That's being talked about, the knowledge of good, of evil, and they're a cult of knowledge. That's what Gnosticism goes back to, or gnosis into Greek comes out of the word, the idea of knowledge. Now, we also have this S that's in this pyramid, but this S is always fashioned like not just an S, but like a serpent. We understand Satan to be a serpent in Revelation 12, just as we understand seraphim angels had a face of a serpent, and that comes out of Numbers 21 as you take that Nakash story of the venomous snakes, except for the image that goes on the pole that's going to save the Israelites. The word Nakash isn't used, but seraphim is used in Hebrew. And so we understand seraphim as also being fiery messengers and fiery serpent angels. So you have this whole serpent imagery coming together, and that S looks like a snake. Now, this son comes from the house of El, right? So he's son of El. So not only is he like a son of God, which is what El is, he's also almost like an antichrist or Messianic type figure, being a son of God as well. And I'm just hitting the surface here on the allegories, and everything that's in, not everything, but so many things that they put into superhero stories is occultic messages brainwashing people. And it's great entertainment. I mean, I love Star Wars. I love superhero stories. but you need to understand that they're communicating messages of their history, their genealogies, and their belief system in all of these types of entertainment.
That's really fascinating. When you start drawing some of those parallels and connecting some of those dots, there's a lot more going on in those stories than just what is on the surface. Another thing I wanted to jump into, it would be a shame if we didn't, so we have to go here. What are some of the secret societies that have grown up, say, out of the Brotherhoods of the Snake? Obviously, you go way in depth in this, so it's really hard to answer this in a single question. But if we had to just give an overview and limit you to 10 minutes, what would you say?
Not a problem. So we'll deal with the modern ones. Okay, and the major society coming out of modern history happens in about 1090 to 1099. And that is this formation of the Knights Templar at a small abbey or a small priory at Sion, where they're going to, after they've excavated under the Jerusalem temple, and they're going to offer King Baldwin the King of Jerusalem title, because he believes he has a descendancy that goes back to the Benjamites and more. So I'm not going to go too far into that aspect. But that's the formation of the Knights Templar. And they become the most powerful society. It's created by powerful royal bloodlines and Masons in Europe that are going to unite with the Essenes, the Johannite brothers, the Gnostics out of Alexandria, and even some of the Sufis, which is Islamic mysticism, where the assassins come in to form this secret society. They're going to form a super society. And they're going to win the sponsorship of the Catholic Church to do their works within the church, even though they're going to worship a pantheon of gods, which is why in 1307 they're disbanded. And so they became the most powerful bankers, the most powerful army, and were developing education, writing, a whole bunch of different things. So after the destruction of the Knights Templar, they don't want to leave this organization centralized. So they want to start forming different groups to decentralize, all with specific agendas to bring on the end time. Because what most people don't understand is end time just doesn't happen. The end time, is ordained and it's permitted by God, but polytheists, they want this rendezvous with destiny. They want to bring the showdown on, and they'll want to do it anytime before the ordained time, but they'll accept the ordained time. And of course, as a Christian, we know that it can't happen until the restrainer is removed. But they're going to continue to try. So they break this out into new groups that they're going to form. First being is the Rosicrucians. They actually started a little bit before at 1188 at the cutting of elms, where there's a split within the Templar group. And so they restart up this ancient order of the Red Cross that goes back into history. And the Rosicrucians are going to be the ones that are going to work to form other secret societies with the royal families, and including the Sarkani Rond and Ordo Docranus in 1408, which Vlad the Impaler is connected with as well, which is another rabbit hole to go down to. And they're going to try and put their kingships back on the thrones that they're losing, and they're going to chase the pursuits of Thoth, which is the development of the 7 sacred sciences. Thoth was the wisdom god out of Egypt mythology. Now, you have, coming on in very short order after 1307, you have the startup of Freemasonry in Scotland with the survivors of the Knights Templar, right? That moves to England next and then around the world. And then you also have Freemasonry and Rosicrucians working in 1640s to 1662 to develop the Royal Society to take education and science and the development of the science away from the Roman Church, right? And develop the pursuits of Thoth again, and to lead people away from God, not give God credit anything, and they're the father of science and education, right? Part of the preparation for brainwashing. You have the banking arm that needs to be recreated, and that's set up in the 1700s with the Rothschilds, right? So they need the banking to do it, and that's set up, and they're also part of the bloodlines. And then you have the Illuminati, which is set up in the 1500s, and their goal is to bring about the fall of Christianity outside the Roman Church and to bring about world government. That's their goal. And they join with Freemasonry in 1775 to 1785, depending on which historian that you're talking about. And then you have the Jesuits, which are recreated to be that enclave within the Roman Catholic Church to again, erode Christianity from within the church. And I know people will argue that they were eroding before that, they were. But understand that the Cistercians, the Augustines, and the Benedictine nuns were the same orders as the Gnostics, right? They were already molded into Christianity doing it, and they were the ones who were sponsoring the Knights Templar, right? And in fact, St. Benedict, or St. Bernard, is actually a Benedictine monk, and he's related to these rich founders of the Knights Templars who are all nobles. So those are the key organizations and agendas that they have to bring about the end time. Now, there's many more orders and stuff, and I'll cover many more in the book, but those are the main ones, and they all tend to answer to the Rosicrucians, who are kind of the puppet masters here. So like the Club of Rome, which answers directly to the Rosicrucians and wants to bring about world government through 10 groups of nations, which is Revelation and Daniel. They were created in the late 60s to do that specifically. And in the Rosicrucians, you have about half of them that have risen up through the Masonic hierarchy. So you have, just quickly, you have Freemasonry, Illuminati, Rosicrucians, right? So, and then the other half are purebloods from the royal families, as they come down through history from the Nephilim royal bloodlines of the dynasties and the kings that we talked about. And then above that, you have a few more orders that will settle up at the 13 families of the West, as we understand that.
Well, another thing that I think would be worthwhile to have you comment on, I mean, you commented on how we see heroes and superheroes in so much of our media today. You know, I've noticed, especially in the last 10 years, we see a lot of representations of the Freemasons and the Knights Templar in a lot of films. I think one that always comes to mind when I go down this rabbit hole or in this direction is the movie National Treasure, which was a very enjoyable movie, but we see the Knights Templar and Freemasons like put on really bold, bright display. Any thoughts on why we're seeing the Freemasons and Knights Templar pop up in so many of our movies and popular stories these days?
When you see repetition of these types of stories, and it goes well beyond that, they're brainwashing us and preparing us for the end time, to accept them coming out in the end time and to accept the deception. And they believe they're the children of light, right? That's what they call themselves, the sons of light. And their God is Lucifer, or the great architect of the universe, as they like to call him, but also Lucifer, who is also, that is an allegory for light. And just as Satan masquerades as an angel of light, they're just preparing us for this knowledge that they're going to present in the end time. Because they're going to just wow people with knowledge and sorcery in the end time. And so if you get into the Templars, it's a very important organization representing very important figures in the genealogies and the history of Freemasonry. So anything that you see that's used over and over and over, like fairy tales, all encoded. Robin Hood, King Arthur, on and on and on and on and on. Anything about Shakespeare, this is an MO that goes right back to Homer and the great classics out of prehistory. This is all the same ideology to keep it alive, to encode the history, the genealogy, and then they use it to brainwash us to prepare what they're going to tell us as the great deceptions in the end time.
Now, Gary, one question I always like to ask as I'm wrapping up an interview, for you as the author, when you think of readers working through your material and getting to the last page of the Genesis 6 conspiracy, how do you most hope that they've been impacted? How do you hope that they'll move forward differently after encountering what you share in the book?
What I'm hoping for is that people's eyes are going to be open to the allegories and the language that these spirit societies utilize and what they're planning on doing, and seeing how they're doing actually matches up with what we're told in prophecy. So if you understand it, you're not going to be deceived, because even the elect are going to be deceived if that were possible. So these are going to be powerful delusions. So you need to understand what they're doing and how they're going to deceive us. And then secondly, if they can start explaining some of this and planting seeds for others who just might wake up, they don't accept it readily, for the deceptions that are coming.
Well, Gary, if the listeners want to connect with you and find out more about the book, where are some of the places that they can find you on the web?
You can go to Genesis6conspiracy.com. That's Genesis6conspiracy.com with the number 6. And on there, I've got some interviews up. I've got generous excerpts of all 98 chapters if you want to get a feel for the book. You can buy a signed copy from me there, or link to barnesandnoble.com or amazon.com or to Kindle. And you can also follow me on Facebook under Gary Wayne. I have 2 Genesis 6 conspiracies, and seemingly I've been put in charge of a page called Giantology that I'll need to look and see what that's all about. But apparently that's under my wing at this point in time. And you can also follow me on Twitter at GaryWayne63, at GaryWayne63. On Facebook, I post regularly, sometimes about the book, but a lot of times just additional information that's not in the book or about what's in the Bible. And so if you're interested in being challenged, I'll have challenging posts going up at least once a week.
And as always, I'll make it easy for the listeners. If you just head on over to SeanTabbitt.com and search for Gary Wayne, I'll have links to his social media, his website, places where you can find the book. It'll all be there in the show notes. It's time to bring this episode of the Sean Tabbitt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Gary Wayne. Once again, our book today was The Genesis 6 Conspiracy. To connect with Gary and find out more about his book, be sure to visit his website at genesis6conspiracy.com. And remember, that is the number 6, genesis6conspiracy.com. Gary, I just want to say thanks so much for sharing with us today. It has been a great pleasure speaking with you.
Well, thank you for having me, and hopefully I've raised some curiosity amongst your audience, and that's always the goal. I mean, I like to sell books, but you can tell by the information and details I provide, I just want to get the information out there.
And that's all for this episode of the Sean Tabbitt Show.